Hello, Podcast Collective Consciousness. I hope all is well in your world. This is the Reconsider Simon podcast. In this audio space, I'll explore consciousness, ufology, high strangeness, the esoteric, spirituality, even the very essence of reality itself. Episode number 6. GeopathicStress, ley lines, grids, and underground water. Hello, welcome. Just continuing on with the series concerning earth energies and the effect on the human body. Today's episode will be looking at geopathic stress as the main focus. It's the main buzzword for this topic. And this all stems from an idea of geopathology, which is the stress and ill health created by geopathic stress on the body. In terms of the mainstream definition from Wikipedia, it says it's the theory that links Earth's inherent radiation with the health of humans, animals, and plants. We can view Earth energies and the shape of the landscape and even the form of the underground, how that's constituted, as being a stress, being a negative aspect to human health or animal health or plant health. But there is obviously an opposite side to this as well. The geology of the landscape, physically and spiritually, it can be healing. You can have ideas of geospirals, spring water, holy wells, positive ley lines. All these things can be really healing to the human body. It's an interesting combination, this subject, a real mix between energies of the invisible, things you can't see, forces you can't see, and the physically noticeable in terms of like water. And there's that strange interaction that occurs, which can create a negative or positive outcome to human bodies. But then, as I mentioned, also to animals and plant life. But interestingly, there are particular animals or plants that actually thrive in areas of what we would call harmful or negative energies. As an example, cats seem to seek out negative energies, negative areas to sleep in. It seems to benefit their bodies in some way. Other forms of geopathic stress that not necessarily stem from invisible energy or the form of the landscape or the constitution of what's going underneath, under the ground. It can come specifically from things like underground oil, rock minerals, creation of natural radiation. I mentioned many times in this podcast that granite has a natural radiation and that, potentially being harmful to people. This subject seems to be divided between the two different traditions on this planet. You have the kind of the European tradition, which feels quite recent in terms of some of the knowledge that has started to surface within the collective. But then if you look at more the Far Eastern traditions, they've had more of this in their history. It's more documentation. There's more kind of information out there that's been known about. In terms of the European traditions, the grandfather of this whole geopathic stress movement, it tends to be Gustav von Pol. I hope he's pronouncing his name correctly. But he was researching a Bavarian town called Wilsberg, again, apologies for the pronunciation, in 1929. And he was looking at a link at Earth radiation and cancer on people. Then we can start to ponder, why is this happening? Obviously, there is this Earth's natural vibration, but in some way it's maybe being distorted by the water courses, the drainage, the geological faults. This physicality may be creating this stress on the human body. Moving our focus over to the Far East in China, there's a lot of documentation which I'll talk about later in terms of geopathic stress. And actually it was properly implemented at the time. It defined their building policy, like how they locate buildings was decided on where the geopathic stress was in the landscape, which is completely different to how obviously it's perceived within the mainstream, like Western traditions. So yeah, in terms of like this episode, we're going to be looking at the two sides, the Western understanding of geopathic stress, a little bit of the sort of Far Eastern sort of Chinese cultural ideas of geopathic stress. We're also going to look at potential solutions to your health, like in terms of healing. Like, again, I've mentioned previously before, I'm going through a sort of quite an intense healing journey. And part of that process has been involving me grounding in the garden. So taking my shoes and socks off and actually kind of just connecting with the landscape. And I found a real steady improvement with my health because I've been doing this practice every single day. So I'll be looking into the benefits of grounding and kind of the science behind it as well. And some of the figureheads that kind of discovered some of this, recent burgeoning information. In terms of, where I'm getting this information from, I mean, it's fragments from bits from the internet that I've just discovered and researched, my own experience, some recent books that I've been reading as well, basically informing a lot of this conversation as well. And a lot of it is subjective, as I've mentioned before. Like, dowsers have a lot of different approaches and defining energy and how it works and how it affects the body. So it's kind of quite subjective, and you've got to bring your own experience into it as well. You have your own biology. And I think sometimes how certain energies affect you might not affect people the same way as well. So I think there's a lot of personal subjectivity on the subject as well. But I'm sure I will bounce around many different subjects in a chaotic way and hopefully create some kind of cohesive thread of understanding of like maybe what's going on to a degree. So let's begin. So, Earth energies. This all links to the subject, I guess, with ley lines, really. It's what people commonly describe them as. And for the Western side of traditions, a lot of the knowledge has surfaced only quite recently, as far back as the 1920s, is when this subject really kind of grew into the collective consciousness through a guy called Alfred Watkins. And at the time, he was driving near Leominster, and he was looking at a Roman camp on his weekend, on his day off. And he got out of his car, and he had a vision. He had a vision of a series of straight alignments between various ancient monuments. He started to see a correlation of these straight lines between standing stones, hill forts, churches, across the landscape. And so this, ignited his interest, and he wanted to research this more. And he then decided to create this organization called the Straight Track Club. And this inspired people around the country who started to get together and actually find straight lines in terms of this alignment between these ancient monuments like he had found and discovered. As many of you are aware, ley lines now tend to be associated with a lot of UFO activity, spirits, ghosts, just mysterious goings on, as well as having that kind of energetic component sort of linking up these various monuments. A lot of the research that was kicked off during the 1920s, unfortunately then dropped out during World War II, because obviously a lot of the men and other people are away at war. So all of these investigations of the landscape pretty much ceased, and it was forgotten about for a number of decades until around about the 1960s. There was a real resurgence. The knowledge still started to build up again. Again, a lot of this information and research can be quite subjective depending on the dowser. Your various dowsers over the years have gone out under their own steam, under their own inspiration, just trying to learn more about this subject with dowsing rods and other forms of divination. Again, some of the information can be quite different from dowser to dowser, I found. But some of the people I'm going to mention within this podcast are Maria Wheatley, Guy Underwood, Hamish Miller, and Hugh Newman, and an American dowser called Sig Longreen. It was through Maria Wheatley's work and research that I became aware of Sig Longreen, who's an American dowser, and he came up with an interesting categorization for ley specifically. One of the first categorizations he had were called T-lines, or T-lays, and they were topographical lays. And all these involved where there's no energy involved, nothing aerial energy, no earth energy. They're purely just alignments of sacred sites, such as standing stones or mounds, etc. There was no energy involved at all. His second classification we called energy lays, or E-lays. And these were actually transmitting energy. So these were aerial energies or underground energies, and they transmitted between stones, mounds, etc., and other kind of sacred sites. And the third classification, he had astrological lays, or A-lays, and these align to astrological events such as solstice, Beltane. And the very fourth one, the final one, the big one, was the TAE lays. And this was the whole shebang. This was topographical, this is astrological, and also energy based as well. And these are areas, quite sacred, special areas, such as Avebury in Wiltshire. These are, hold that classification. But a lot of the dowsers and the people that are understanding these energies are looking at it with a female and male expression, seeing these two powerful currents, yin and yang, which just starts to fuse some of the Western traditions with Eastern mysticism as well. And the Feng Shui masters called this Lung Mai, which is dragon's breath. And in China, buildings were actually built along dragon lines to sort of maintain that harmony within the buildings themselves. And this same sort of female and male expression, yin and yang, dragon lines within the UK and other countries, it coil around these adjacent ley lines, around these sacred sites. And researchers Hamish Miller and Paul Broadhurst in the 1980s were coined as being the main discoverers of this positive male yang energy line called the Michael line, and the female yin Mary negative line, which both of them cross the south of England and ends up on the Norfolk coast. And it's one of the most famous ley lines within the United Kingdom and links up a lot of the sacred sites, such as Avebury and Stonehenge, etc. As these female and male lines sort of dance around the landscape, sometimes they can be quite far apart. But when they cross and when they intersect, that's when something quite magical has happened, and it's quite a powerful spot. And that's, again, places like Avebury. This is where the convergence of those two male and female expressions come together. I know I described as the male and female expression as being, potentially negative or positive. That's not meant in a disparaging way or a negative way, but there are, potential ley lines or energy lines that are harmful to the human body or cause disease, and they can be described as negative or positive, but it's not anything to do with the male or female expression. It's just potentially maybe down to the health of it, is something interacting with it artificially that's actually creating this disease. And again, within the West, we've only been really aware consciously, well, in terms of the mainstream, normal people being aware of these energy lines and this whole system for the last 100 years. So it's hard to kind of gauge exactly what's come before, but how much of modern technology in terms of electrification, radio waves, microwave, wave, Wi-Fi, all of these things, how much is that contributing to ill health of some of these energy lines? Is there an artificial component to this? It's kind of creating this sickness? Or do you get ley lines that are sick naturally, that are negative, that cause ill health naturally for some particular reason due to the geopathic stress emanating from underneath the earth? And I can only really talk about my own experience, and I'm not saying this is correct or not in terms of the information I'm about to talk about, but it was during that period of time, sort of during all the government lockdowns, when there's very little to do in terms of like being able to meet people inside. So I spent a lot of time in the South Downs just, walking, because it was a brilliant summer as well that year as well, really warm and hot, brilliant weather. So I spent a lot of happy times just exploring the landscape. And one of those adventures, it took me to the Longman of Wilmington, which is, again, on the South Downs, probably only about half an hour, 3/4 an hour's drive away from Brighton at the time. And the Longman of Wilmington is this huge figure that's been carved into the side of the hill, and he exposes the white chalk underneath. Now it's been sort of, in terms of the modern times, it's been manipulated a little bit. I seem to remember they have like a bit of white breeze block or some kind of tile there now over some of the white bits. But yeah, it's been there for a very long time. Again, it's probably hard to date exactly when. But I was very aware on the back of the hill, there's the actual Longman himself on the side of the hill. But if you go right to the top, to the peak of the hill itself, there's a huge earthworks there. There's a tumulus, there's a long barrow, round barrow. So there's a lot of sacred activity going on there. And as I've mentioned before, getting conspiratorial, there is an underground waterworks there as well, which always seems to factor in some of these sacred sites. I don't know why. Maybe I'm just looking too deeply into the subject, but there always seems to be underground waterworks there. And someone quite hilariously graffitied on the side of the building, Illuminati base or something, just playing into that idea. But it wasn't until later when I read in about this whole area that actually there was a ley line. I did feel it, and I did think about it at the time, because there's a immediate alignment between these sacred areas in terms of the long round barrow and the actual kind of figure itself. But there's a larger alignment which links up a Benedictine priory and two churches, St. Mary and also St. Peter's. Now, there are many theories about who the long man is. Could be linked to giants. There's various stories and myths to do with giants around that particular area. Other people have spoken about Beowulf, Thor, Apollo. But I prefer to go with the Alfred Watkins, the guy who originally discovered this ley-lined activity within the landscape. He perceived the long man of Wilmington being a dodman, and the dodman is holding sighting staves. And this is a sort of a very ancient form of ley-line hunter, essentially. And these staves were used, they were his tools of divination, essentially. Now, all of these sites are supposed to be, pre-Roman, and there is a lot of the mainstream archaeology sort of says it's a Roman road. But as I've mentioned before, like in Chester, where I am at the moment, they have a lot of Roman roads, but people have said, maybe the Romans were just literally copying the roads that were already there that were put in by civilizations before them. So yeah, again, maybe this road stretches far back beyond Roman times, particularly with all these ancient sites scattered around the landscape itself. But anyway, the day that I went there for the first time, it was a glorious sunny day, like really hot and warm. And I spent a lot of time just like hanging around, just looking around, looking at the view. And then I realized I started to feel quite sick. Like I was lying on the ground. I really started to feel a little bit ill, a bit queasy. And I was like, that's strange, because initially I had a real kind of relaxed feeling about that area. And then I just started to sort of look around, and I noticed actually directly in the same line of sight, there was a huge aerial tower in the distance, right on the same line. And then I just started to theorize later, is this kind of interference, this artificial interference, maybe creating that disease within that energy line itself? And then you can start to ponder, was that randomly placed there, unconsciously? It was just, okay, was this a good place to put a radar area, or is there something more nefarious, something more negative, that they actually knew what they were doing? These are just my own theories and experiences, and I'm not saying they're true totally, but just, it's an interesting thing to think about, considering in terms of the health of ley lines and how it affects human body, and what the effect I was having in that experience. And again, referring back to another personal experience, as I've mentioned before, I was living in a village, Ditchling, which is slightly outside of Brighton. It has its own little church based on a mound. There seems to be a series of churches all in a line, if you look on the map. And initially I was living in a flat, right, there's a small roundabout in this village. I was living in a flat just right on the corner. And I loved it there. I was really, really settled. And then unfortunately, the guy actually owned the place, decided he wanted to sell, so I had to move out. And then luckily, just up the road, there was an apartment, a flat just a few doors up. And I thought, this is synchronistic. This is amazing. It's the same price, and means I don't have to move my stuff too far away. And I'm really liking living in Ditchling as well. So I was really happy to move there. And then I moved in, and again, I was, struggling with my health at the time. And I moved into this new place, and, found it a lot colder than the previous place, which is fine. I can kind of deal with that. But while I was there, I was really feeling the energy. And bearing in mind that this new place I've moved into is directly behind the church. And I was a little bit concerned the fact that this church has a very, very old graveyard as well in the periphery of the church. And I was aware that the energy coming from the cemetery is not particularly great. But, I thought maybe the stars were aligned and this flat was meant for me, so maybe it's going to be fine. So that's kind of why I moved in. And I could really feel the energy of this place in my body itself. And initially, I thought it was positive. But as the months kind of went on, I started to understand that this actually was negative, affecting my health, and my healing journey was being suppressed quite significantly. It was also just draining me full of energy as well. I just had zero energy. And so it was only till I left there to sort of move in with some family to kind of continue on healing that I realized actually how much of this flat had actually been draining my energy. And I guess it's because it's right on this energy line and it's behind the cemetery, and all of these factors are really affecting me quite badly. So I've now had to sort of move all my stuff out of that place, move it into storage until I'm properly better again, completely healed. So there's another personal experience. There was no real artificialness involved. Again, I'll highlight the fact on that same line, that links up the church, which is called St. Margaret's Church, to I think it's Kema Church. In between both of them, right on the line, there's another underground water treatment facility. Again, maybe I'm just looking into it too much, but I don't know whether that's affected in some way. But, that's there. But I actually do put maybe this, the unhealthiness of it down to potentially the cemetery that was there that wasn't helping. But maybe there are other factors at play that I don't really understand. But, I mean, I mentioned it previously before, but a lot of these churches are all built on mounds. So they have the propensity to have been really quite early sacred places for sun worship, potentially. And there are remnants of, standing stones around a lot of these sites as well, denoting potentially that there were standing stones there for ceremony or other area, for ceremony or other spiritual happenings, whatever they may be at that particular time. Actually, I just remembered, in terms of that first apartment, I did really like living there. And, both of them I really like living there. They're both really lovely places. But the second place, obviously, there was something going on in terms of the energy lines or the energy coming from the cemetery that's actually causing ill health for me. But the first one, it was only recently I had like an epiphany. But although it was good, it was a great place to live. It was a little bit noisy because it was on the main thoroughfare for the village, and it was quite a lot of traffic noise from the bedroom window. So that was a kind of downside. And I did have problems sleeping there. I would actually have quite bad dreams there sometimes and wake up in a real panic, real terror. And this might not be part of your belief system, but I had like some spiritual healing from someone. She was saying that, you were being sort of messed around with in your sleep. This is why this was going on. This is a lot of spiritual or spirit activity was going on in this building that was causing you problems. And actually looking back, I was like, yeah, because the only way I could get a good night's sleep, I would actually have to sort of cleanse the area. I'd have loads of little bags. You get those seal up sandwich bags. I'd fill it with a cup of Himalayan salt. I'd basically have two under my pillow and then salt bags all around my bed underneath the duvet. And this was literally the only way I'd get a night's sleep. So whatever I was doing, it was obviously then helping to protect me through the night. So looking back, it wasn't the best place. I think obviously that village is very old, and particularly there's a lot of sort of dead people buried there due to various cemeteries being around. So yeah, even though it's a dichotomy, isn't it? Because there was great beneficial energies there, and it was in the countryside, and it was, it's such a beautiful spot. But, there was a downside to it, definitely, which now, again, with hindsight, I kind of see. So the message is, kids, don't live behind the cemetery to make your life easier. Yeah, I think, interestingly, you get a lot of those films, particularly in America, they talk about old Indian burial grounds. And obviously there's something in that, living close to sort of dead bodies is not the greatest. And I always find that weird about churches, actually, just talking about it. Just the fact that, you've got this sacred spot and then you just put loads of dead people in the ground. And then particularly the cathedrals, there's just dead people everywhere. There's dead people in the floor. There's dead people in the walls. It's like literally a building covered in dead people. So yeah, I can understand they want to be close to God, and that's the whole idea behind it. But in terms of the energies being beneficial, it kind of denigrates any positive nature, I would guess, of being in that particular building if you've got that kind of level of death energy floating around. Maybe that's my own personal opinion, just kind of, I could be totally wrong about that. But yeah, that's just my opinion. But I mean, I did say that, some dowsers perceive certain ley lines being negative or positive. There is research apparently that in the 1970s they tried to grow mustard seed. They grow a certain amount of mustard seed on a ley line, and they'd grow other mustard seed outside of a ley line. And it appeared that the seed germinated, and their growth was restricted. The ones that are actually planted on the ley line. So it wasn't that great for them. So could this then be scaled up? The idea of living close to a ley line, is that good? And you can look at places, perceived as vortexes where you have various energy lines converging, such as Avebury, Glastonbury, or the US listeners, Sedona, really powerful, energetic places. And some people say you shouldn't really live there. Again, these are sacred places. You go there for ceremony. you get your benefits, then you kind of leave. But I've heard a lot of stories, particularly with Glastonbury and Avebury, of people's lives just falling apart, them just being kicked out of that area. It's just too much. And it can create problems for people mentally. So they start to then lean towards addictions and alcoholism. So there's even though these places are quite energetic, there's so much light there, it also seems to attract a lot of darkness as well, weirdly. And the same, could be said for Brighton as well. I mean, exactly the same. As that real creativity and spirit and energy about the place, but it does have a very dark underbelly to it as well. But going back to the old European traditions, a lot of the time when people were building houses, apparently they would see where, particularly in rural areas, they would see where sheep were laying at night. And that could indicate a good place to build your house, because it's free from geopathic stress, because there's an innate mechanism within these animals that kind of dictates where they, lie down. So they know it's not going to cause them harm if they stay there too long. So if they're sleeping there at night, then it's a good indication that that place is a good place to build. And more specifically, not just building the entire building, but actually where you should place your prospective bedroom as well. Because if a sheep's been sleeping there or a horse has been sleeping there, then it could be, again, an indication of a really good energy area to be. But in terms of that, negative or positive effect of the ley lines on the human body, it can change. It's in constant flux. And these energy places are really affected by various forces, such as the full moon, sunspots, like sun activity. This creates more intensification within these energetic areas. Certain weather activity can also trigger certain energies within the lines themselves. In terms of my own personal experience, I guess in terms of the earth energies, I've only been really absorbing and reading about this subject probably over these last, I don't know, not long, sort of 5-6 years maybe. So not a long period of time, but I have been aware of, even before that, at very energetic places. And looking back, one of my first experiences with this idea of energy lines, not really being consciously, could never really describe or understand what was going on. But I remember the very, very first time I went to Glastonbury, and it was actually for the music festival, the Glastonbury Music Festival, massive event. And I went when I was about 17, and it was where various people from the art college I was at the time. And we drove down in my car, and we were able to actually buy a ticket for HMV, this music shop, over the counter for about 60 or 70 quid. Now you could never do that. I mean, the tickets cost hundreds of pounds, and you have to book months and months in advance. It's all done on the internet, and they sell out so quickly. But back then it was a lot easier to kind of get in. Anyways, it's probably one of the first ever excursions I'd been on with friends without, family, essentially. So we drove down to Glastonbury. I remember walking around just feeling a real palpable energy vibration. And at the time, I knew nothing about the energetic, areas of Glastonbury. I knew nothing about that in terms of megaliths and ley lines. It just didn't even enter my consciousness at all, but I was very aware of the energy. I can still feel it. I can still remember that moment. But obviously over the years, especially recent years, I've become more spiritual and more conspiratorial. So I kind of know more about these things. And so, I'm able to experience more in Brighton, and it took me to places because I started to have an understanding of this, and I wanted to learn dowsing. Went to places like Wiltshire, and I started to have more experiences. And then returning to Glastonbury, because before I'd never really been to Glastonbury, the town itself, I'd always just been to the music festival. But going to Glastonbury itself, the times I've been there, my heart has just sung. It's just really palpable, really visceral experience. And in terms of an experience beyond this country, the United States, again, I've mentioned it many times before. I've been to California quite a number of times. I remember I'd flown in, and then we were going to visit family. I'd gone with my family as well. We were staying in a motel quite close to LAX, the airport. And it was just, cheap hotel. It was nice. It was fine. We stayed the night there. And the idea was then to drive to see family in Palm Springs. And I remember I was just doing my spiritual practice in the morning the next day, and I could feel, this area was just quite run down, very industrial looking, not particularly attractive, but I could just feel the energy pulsating from the land as I was meditating. I was doing various Qigong exercise. It was really, really powerful. I always remember it. And I have no idea what was creating that powerful energy experience in this motel in California. I guess I know there's a lot of underground water under the desert, vast areas of water, which some people perceive as being what's called yin water, spring water, highly oxygenated water, very, very different to rainwater. So maybe this is what's affecting it. But anyway, this kind of brings us on to the next topic of geopathic stress and earth energies in terms of how water affects this. Now, again, this tends to be a subjective thing. I was taught by Maria Reeton. She's a really big advocate for having two types of water. You have a male expression, you have a female expression. The male being the yang and the female being the yin. And for the yang, that would be rainwater. And rainwater could have fallen thousands of years ago. So the time scale is kind of could be anything. It could be thousands of years again, or it could be as recent as today. That's how they define yang water. But then you get the female expression, which is yin. And some people actually call this primary water. And this gets into a lot of interesting research. There's a lady called Deborah Tavares, and she speaks a lot about this. And she perceives this yin water, this very healing water, that's very abundant, has been hidden from humanity. We all talked about scarcity. There's a scarcity of resources. Maybe the opposite is completely true. Maybe it was just total abundance. And this idea that actually water is actually created in the Earth's crust. It's not like a finite research. It's just constantly there. And humanity could tap into this at any time. It's a real abundance of water just underneath the ground. You just need to know where to look. And there's no need to drink river water or processing sewage water or like desalinating seawater. Like there's really, really powerful spiritual water underneath, where you stand on this land. Yin water, primary water, it's abundant everywhere. And this primary, spiritual, highly energized female water, is that what people are interacting with at holy healing, water wells, at these holy sites where you get these healing waters? Is this what this yin water is? Now I'm going to start bringing in more of Maria Wheatley's work in, and she's really into the idea of the yin and the yang water. And she speaks a lot about geospirals, and these are really like positive energies, really healing to the human body, what are called geospirals or blind springs. Apparently in America, they call them water domes. But it creates this very harmonic surface pattern on the earth, like a spiral. This is due to high pressure. The water just can't permeate through rock strata. It's just impermeable. So it just domes up and starts to escape through various fissures within the landscape itself. And this creates this energetic pattern. I don't know how, but apparently according to her, it creates this energetic pattern. It's a geospiral. She claims that Stonehenge, on the altar stone underneath, there's this 7-coil spiral, this geospiral is found directly underneath the stone. And, this same mechanism can be found at other stone circles, across the world. Long barrels, dolmens, cairns, Irish towers, I spoke about that recently as well. Pyramids, medicine wheels. Also, you get solitary stones a lot in Scotland, and she claims that this marks the spot of some of these blind springs themselves. It marks this really energetic, really healing place to be. Maria also mentions that a lot of these geospirals can be found in a lot of European churches and cathedrals, and is actually set underneath the altar. That's the specific place where these geospirals are found, and is probably why the churches and cathedrals are actually positioned there, because, again, these were ancient sacred sites that span way before Christianity. But this healing spring water, this yin water, can be found really around the UK. And a lot of the times it's been forgotten about, and this is the same around the world. This primary water, this miracle healing water, can be found in countries like France, Mexico, Germany, and India. And what happens, you get large numbers of people flocking to these places for healing, for spiritual advancement, in terms of the science and the scientific understanding, like how people, trying to explain some of these ideas of like healing and what happens at these places with these waters. Some people have theorized it actually has dissolved hydrogen gas within the water itself. And it's either the molecular hydrogen reacts due to the alkali earth, metals and this combination kind of creating that hydrogen gas, or it's actually from gas produced from bacteria or either algae as well. Some of the famous locations around the world for these healing waters, there's one at Lourdes in France, a fountain there was discovered in 1958 by a 14-year-old girl called Bernadette. And she had a vision. She had a vision of Mother Mary, who appeared in a shallow cave. And the vision told her that a church should be built on this space in its position, and people will visit the hill at these sacred waters, these sacred wells. And that apparently is what happened. This church was built and it became this sacred site, this sacred area of spring water, and people had these miraculous healings, these cures. Moving on to another location, Nordenau Fountain in Germany, and this is placed 100 kilometers east of Dusseldorf. And again, it's pure waters, yin water, healing waters, discovered in a cave, which is apparently as a disused slate mine. And an old woman who's blind in one eye just covered her eye with this water, and then miraculously she regained sight. And so this created this whole culture of people again visiting this fountain to get healing, and it apparently healed various ailments. An ex-miner, healed his back problems. There's a whole list of them. This is just a couple of sacred places. Obviously, the whole world is scattered with stories like this, so it's not unique to these European countries. So yeah, I mean, there's obviously evidence there. There's situations there of people healing through these waters for some reason. But these are the positive stories. These are the miraculous healings through this female expression of the waters, which is yin water. What about the negative? And this all then surrounds the idea of yang water, the male expression of water. And again, this is water that has fallen, 100 years ago, thousands of years ago, or as recent as today. So, broad time span. But a dowser called Alf Riggs, he did a lot of discovery and research into this particular area and looked into the causes of ME. And he found a lot of the negative health implications came from this underground yang male expression water. I will link some of this research in the description so you can kind of read deeper into it, because it is quite technical and quite scientific. So yeah, I'll leave you to do that on your own time. Further research into this area was looked at by Guy Underwood, and he was a British geophysicist and also dowser. And he discovered it was his idea that underground streams that actually cross at right angles can produce severe geopathic stress, severe ill health, and long-term exposure can create serious illness. And even short-term can cause things like depression and just really, really low mood. In terms of the shape and the form of these energies that are creating this geopathic stress that stems from this underground water, it creates this reversed circle he described, like an outward spiral. And interestingly, there's a correlation between some of our ancestors. That outward spiral actually represented a lack of spiritual protection. So there was a strange correlation between the two. And according to Maria Wheatley, some of the things she said, that actually places of execution were actually situated above some of these places of geopathic stress. The gallows in Tower Hill, London, she claims is actually placed above this area of geopathic stress. And also what are called blind houses, which I'd never heard of before, but they were essentially for condemned people or prisoners. And again, they were essentially buildings with no real windows there at all. They were just on purpose there to create as much disease and as much depression and ill health as possible, because they were for these condemned people, these prisoners, as part of their punishment. But they were placed structurally right above these very toxic positions where you had this very toxic energy emanating from underneath due to the geopathic stress, again, from the yang water itself. When you look into a lot of the research to do with geopathic stress, there's a hell of a lot of information coming from places, countries like Germany and Russia. They seem to have a really open mind to these concepts in terms of geopathic stress and earth energies and how it affects the human body. As I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, in South Germany in the 1930s, the proposed grandfather of geopathic stress, Baron Gustav von Pohl. Again, sorry if I messed that name up, but he located around about 54 homes where people had actually died of cancer in this particular town. He was able to map the sites, and he could mapped the detrimental energies within the landscape, and that correlated with some of the homes of these people that actually died of cancer. And even more fascinating, he was able to pinpoint the real, points of extreme geopathic stress and where it located with these people's bedrooms. And that actually he was able to then pinpoint where the cancer was in the body due to where their bed was placed within the landscape. He actually published a book of his findings. I couldn't seem to find it. It's quite an old one, I think. It's called the Radiation, the Causative Factor in Disease and Cancer. So maybe you can have a better look at finding it, but he wrote a lot of his research within that book itself. Then there's another academic as well, Swiss Dr. Hans Jenny. We've mentioned her before. She was the academic who discovered cymatics, that the formation of sound when you physically vibrate sand on this vibrating plate, it reorganizes into these beautiful patterns. Anyway, but Dr. Hans Jenny, as well as the cymatics, she did an experiment over a span of about 12 years involving 24,000 mice. And she tested a radiation zone, and she would try and place these mice of this radiation zone. And she'd notice they'd want to flee, they'd want to run away from this area. They had this innate ability within their body to feel the disease and to obviously just try and get as far away from it as possible. But she made them forcefully to live within this radiation zone. And what she discovered, it created lower birth rates and also higher infant mortality across the mice over the various generations. There's a real measurable effect. Then again, back in Germany in the 1960s, Heidelberg University and Technical University in Munich did a comparative study of a house in Neckar Valley. And apparently this house had 3 generations who had all died of stomach cancer. And they brought along with them, these academics, various instruments and were able to measure the intersection of an underground watercourse and a geological fracture underneath the ground. And they actually tested mice in wooden cages over this area of geopathic stress that was underneath the house. And they found that the mice became a lot more restless, a lot more violent. Their behavior was really deeply affected. I mean, all of this begs the question, what is going on, scientifically? And apparently some physicists, engineers have theorized that neutron radiation, which is generated deep within the Earth, rises up and interacts with the Earth's magnetic field. So maybe this is kind of part of what's causing this disease, this geopathic stress. Moving over to Russia, some of the scientists there from the Institute of Hygiene and Occupational Disease, they talked about there was a dangerous presence of microwave radiation coming from some of these underground watercourses. And also they claim that some of the sites show ionization changes, acoustic anomalies and gamma radiation. And this all, according to them, decreases the geomagnetic field intensity. What can make this problem even worse when you have this junction of water veins? A serious problem can be created when this energy is then emanating through radioactive rock, like granite. And they were able to use really super sensitive measuring devices to measure this radiation right above the water veins in the Earth. Because what caught my eye about some of this research, especially in terms of affecting, the geomagnetic field, the geomagnetic field covers the entire Earth and it protects us from cosmic energies. Now, there's a correlation between some of these geopathic stresses and energy lines with high strangeness, like ghost activities, etc. And what I find really interesting is that, again, with this reduction of the geomagnetic field, some people have theorized that some of these places like Skinwalker Ranch or other areas where you get a lot of high strangeness in terms of UFO activity and, what they deem as skinwalkers, these weird interdimensional entities which are able to phase in and out of reality, these dog men with bright red eyes and, a whole host of really strange activity. And I was listening to a talk by a researcher called Linda Moulton Howe. She's done a lot of research into high strangeness. And she was talking to apparently an insider, and they were discussing how areas where it has really low destabilized magnetic fields, geomagnetic fields, where you get this high strangeness. So it kind of correlates this between all these things in terms of geopathic stress and the magnetic field being affected, and also this linked to the high strangeness aspect as well. Another researcher, again European, this is before World War II, called Pierre Cody. He was a French engineer, and he found a link between ionizing radiation and cancer, and was actually able to measure it using an electrometer. And he found regular disturbances of energy underneath beds of 7,000 cancer sufferers. And he found radiation levels were 10 times higher than normal beds. So this is why it's kind of creating that disease, creating that cancer within the human body. And he also found it doesn't matter that you're maybe sleeping on the ground floor. This energy rises up at great heights. So you can be on the first or second floor and you're still getting a real hit of quite negative energy to your body. So what are the solutions to this? I mean, obviously, this is a regular thing. Doesn't matter where you are. There is geopathic stress, and it causes people disease. It causes cancer. It causes a whole host of conditions as well. Again, I've mentioned before, there's a lady called Judy Jack I've been quite interested in. I bought various, I haven't read all of them yet, but she's got a lot of books to do with geopathic stress and earth energies in the human body. And she was just relaying, I just dipped into one of her books, for the purpose of this podcast. And she was talking about how she had a house and she started to understand that she had quite severely bad geopathic stress coming from underground water. And her friend gave her a solution to how to mitigate this. And she advised to bury calcium ascorbate in a jar and bury it on the line of the watercourse itself. And Judy Jacker claims that it rectified the problem. She found that a couple of years later, she had to dig it up, and she noticed that it's like basically vitamin C, but this was able to mitigate some of the harmful energies. But she had to replenish it, had to replace it, to put more of this calcium back into the jar and then bury it in the ground again. According to her, it worked. I have no idea if it does, but this is what she claimed. But into more of a technical way, scientific way, a mainstream way approach to this, like how do you mitigate against some of this geopathic stress? A German professor, K.E. Lotz, and he came from a technical university, and he wrote a book called Want to Live Healthily. Again, I couldn't really find this book, but apparently he wrote it. Maybe it was quite a while ago. But he was able to measure the students' skin resistance when they stood over some of this unhealthy underground water. And again, this just indicated disturbances in their body, some of this ill health that it was creating. So his solution that he developed, he created what was called an interference Doppler transmitter. I hope I said that right. But he would use it over such as some of these geopathic stresses, these sites. And according to him, it overrides this microwave radiation. He saw it as microwave radiation. That was what was creating these cancers, this disease. And this device kind of mitigated these effects and re-established a normal background radiation within the field of the area. But on the flip side, a lot of these energies we've been discussing have an obvious effect on the human body negatively. But there are certain animals that seem to seek out these energies, that they seem to thrive in. This is only through my reading that people are saying that ants are attracted by these energies. They like to build their nests in these negative areas. Whereas, again, animals like sheep, dogs, goats, cows, they will move away from these harmful areas. They seem to, be repelled by them. Again, household cats, as I mentioned earlier, they seem to seek them out. They seem to like to sleep in these areas. And it's not just animals, it can be plants, it can be trees as well that are attracted by certain energies. In the northern hemisphere, people have said deciduous trees such as oak and elm can be found more over geopathic stress like watercourses. But in comparison, on the flip side, beeches and birch, they'll stay away from these geopathic stresses. I've just explored quite a lot of the European understanding. Again, this is still quite recent history as we've kind of uncovered some of this information. Is all quite new. But for the Chinese, this is kind of old news. They've had an understanding of this for a very, very long time. And I discovered this website called landandspirit.net. And it's from this couple that seem to live in Sussex as well, in Forest Row. And they seem to have a lot of information to do with geopathic stress. So I'd be quite interested to kind of learn more about them. But they have an article on their website, and it's called Background to Geopathic Stress, the History of Geopathic Stress Research. They have sizable chunks of information to do with geopathic stress and the Chinese traditions. And so I'm going to read a few extracts from their website. The article starts from the Chinese. I'm sorry in advance, I'm going to butcher some of these names. but it starts Chinese Emperor Chao Yu, 2205 to 2197 BC, so very long time ago, proclaimed an edict affected to this day which reads, "No dwelling shall be built until the earth diviners have confirmed the intended building site to be free of earth demons." So I guess they're referring to geopathic stress. Then another extract, it goes Chen Su Zhao, again sorry for the pronunciation, butchering these names, 1332 AD. In the subterranean regions there are alternate layers of earth and rock and flowing spring waters. These strata rest upon thousands of vapours which are distributed in tens of thousands of branches, veins and thread-like openings. The body of the earth is like that of a human being, ordinary people not being able to see the veins and vessels which are disposed in order within the body of man. Think that is no more than a lump of solid flesh, likewise not being able to see the veins and vessels which are disposed in order under the ground. They think that the earth is just a homogeneous mass. I'll of course link this article in the description. There's more to it. I'm just reading sort of particular extracts. There's another aspect. Christopher Bird, The Divining Hand, 1979. It was believed by the ancient Chinese that water flowed in subterranean courses called veins of the dragon, or lung mai. Passing to and fro out of sight, the hidden veins of water served like the bloodstream of animals to remove impurities from the body of the earth and to deposit curative minerals within it. The Earth's circulatory system was matched by an ever-undulating network of currents in the atmosphere. The currents running through the mai, or channels, carried the Q, or vapours. I said Q there, but I actually meant Ki, so obviously that's similar to the energy of prana, the same thing. So there you go. I mean, it's a really good encapsulation. I think that Chinese had a really deep understanding to geopathic stress, and it correlates a lot with what European researchers have been looking into as well. So yeah, that's we've kind of covered ley lines like earth energies, and then the water aspect as well. The geopathic stress that's created upon the water, whether it be male or female, and the healing properties of that water as well. But there's another aspect in terms of like what's called the energy grid, which is similar to a ley line, I guess, in a way, but it's also very, very different. It seems to sort of span the landscape, but it's strange. These grids always seem a little bit more artificial to me. But these energy grids cover the planet from pole to pole, and there's a variety of different ones, and there's a lot which have been discovered. Some of the first ones that were kind of popularized was one that was discovered by Dr. Ernest Hartmann. The second one's quite well known, from Dr. Manfred Curry. And another one, more recent one, is called the Benker grid. And they are all like walls of geopathic energy emanating from deep underground and rising up into the sky. So they're quite, sizable. And again, there's a certain duality, dichotomy with these lines, because depending on where you are, some can be okay for the health, but then others can be actually, really stressful to the human body and cause a lot of illness and disease as well. So yeah, again, it's a kind of yin and yang thing. So let's kick off with the Hartmann grid, which was discovered in the 1950s by Dr. Hartmann. And the reason he discovered this, he was actually taking blood samples, blood tests for sedimentation. And he found that it varied depending on where the blood samples were actually taken in terms of where the patient was physically stood within a particular room, within a physical space. And he discovered it could either be, the patient could be sort of positioned on a positive or negative element of the grid, of the Hartmann grid. And this would affect the sedimentation rate within the blood test itself. It could either increase or decrease the sedimentation. And sedimentation essentially is the immune response to inflammation. So obviously the grid in some way, shape or form was eliciting a type of immune response depending where you actually stood within the grid itself. After further investigations and study,